All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bryant, and welcome to my lecture recital. Today, I want to talk to you all about jazz pedagogy, in particular at the middle school level. So, the name of this is the application, it's a running title, The Application of Pedagogical Principles Used in Middle School Jazz Band Teaching. So, quick introduction. Did you know that the majority of collegiate music education programs within the state of Florida do not involve more than one jazz pedagogy or jazz-related class in their curriculum? It's crazy, right? Unless one has studied jazz or grew up playing it, it may be difficult to teach the subtle nuances of the jazz idiom. So renowned jazz educator David Baker states, "It is a consensus among jazz educators that any teacher going out to teach today, even in suburbia, is going to be decidedly disadvantaged without at least a basic acquaintance with the imperatives of jazz and ethnic music." David Baker. So, what does this have to do with the teaching of middle school jazz and the lack of text? Well, if most education students are not learning or playing jazz in school, that means they probably don't feel comfortable teaching it after graduation when they get their first gig. If they don't feel comfortable teaching, usually teachers will attend professional developments or try to find help in some form of a book, some form of text. In this case, jazz pedagogy text has been developed in order to help directors with little to no training in the jazz idiom. The only issue there is that there are prominent jazz pedagogy books or texts that do not directly address middle school jazz band. So, that's the problem. No middle school texts that directly address middle school jazz band. So my purpose is to identify and examine the application of major jazz band pedagogical principles with expert middle school jazz band teachers to determine how these principles can be established or applied in the middle school jazz band setting. That's my purpose. So before we do that, let's talk about the pedagogy books that we are using, or what I use for my study. The two pedagogy books that were used in my study were the top one, Jazz Pedagogy, the Jazz Educator's Handbook and Resource Guide by Richard Dunscan, who is a nationally and internationally recognized expert in the field of jazz music and jazz education. And Dr. Willie Hill Jr., who's the director of the Fine Arts Center at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a professor of music education. In the preface of this text, the authors state that this book was written for all educators, but would be an ideal textbook for the university courses in jazz pedagogy. The second book study, which is at the bottom, is entitled The Jazz Educator's Handbook by Jeff Jarvis and Doug Beach. Jeff Jarvis is a renowned trumpet player, composer, jazz educator, and music publisher, who's also the director of jazz studies at Cal State, California State University, Long Beach, Cal State Long Beach. Doug Beach is also a performer. He's also an arranger, composer, Grammy Award winner, who serves as the director of jazz studies at the Elmhurst College in Illinois. And according to the authors, this text is suitable for use at the university level and for band directors who find themselves teaching instrumental jazz at the secondary schools with little to no training in the jazz idiom. So, as we all can see, these texts are written by prominent jazz pedagogues for every level except middle school. So here lies the problem. Middle school students can learn to play jazz at a high level if you teach them to, but there seems to be no pedagogical text that directly addresses middle school jazz band teaching. So I decided to interview prominent educators in the South Florida area who have had success in the jazz idiom, not only in the state, but nationally as well. So let's talk about the educators that I decided to interview. Eric Rivero, top right, he has not only taken his middle school jazz band to multiple superiors over multiple years in his tenure, he has also taken his band to play at Gin. He's also taken his middle school band to play at Midwest. And if you know anything about that, that's a very, very big feat. Michelle Fernandez-Denlinger, bottom left. Michelle Fernandez is an amazing, amazing educator. She spent a lot of time at Miami Senior High, but also Corway K through 8, where she taught beginning band and jazz band and wind ensemble. One of the cool things about Michelle is that she right now is a publisher. She's published a lot of her works through, I believe, Alfred Publishing. Steve Kirkland, top left, a saxophone player in the area, great saxophone. He used to teach at Hammocks Middle School, and Hammocks Middle School used to constantly and perennially always have straight superiors on their jazz band evaluation sheets through the MPA. And last but not least, Robert Keaton is the bottom right. He is split tie between Gulliver Preparatory High School and the middle school, and has brought superiors both to them. He's also married to a wonderful vocalist in the area, Lisanne Lyons, who from what I was told during my interview, that now she does jazz. She started the first jazz vocal group at Gulliver Prep. So we're in some good company. So let's talk about the data. To gather information, right, the data collection, to gather information from the 4 educators, I conducted what is called a semi-structured, in-depth interview. Now, the purpose of this interview style is to ask open-ended questions to obtain and gain a deeper understanding of the interviewer's perspectives. I then conducted what is called a thematic analysis. And a thematic analysis is a form of qualitative data analysis, QDA, on the educator transcripts and the 6 concepts found in these books. I then coded all the information, grouped them, and compared all the themes, which we'll talk about later. So, in this next section, I will discuss the expectations and differences between the text targeted toward college and advanced high schools and current middle schools. With this information, this comes from highly respected and highly experienced jazz band educators, as we just learned. So let's get into it. Concept number 1 is improvisation. So Dr. Christopher Zera, the professor of music teaching and learning at the Jazz Studies and Contemporary Media at the Eastman School of Music, states improvisation is the manifestation of musical thought. Abstract thing for a 6th grader to grasp onto. It is also one of the most important aspects of jazz music, but can be one of the more challenging topics to teach. So I conducted a thematic analysis on both the books, and the primary theme found in both was the use of melodic embellishment. Dunscombe and Hill state that the ultimate goal for a jazz musician is to play effortlessly what is heard in their mind. This makes sense that they would start their improvisation chapters off with providing 6 steps to building vocabulary and oral skills for improv. The Jarvis and Beach book stated clearly, once the students have learned a simple melody, the author suggests that they add embellishments and introduce slight rhythmic patterns and variations. They also go on to say, once the student goes beyond embellishing the melody, the next step doesn't have to be a flurry of 30-second notes, but could just be a nice melody over the chord progression. So the second theme when it came to the book is the learning of chords and scales. In the first example, for beginner improvisation, Dunscombe and Hill instruct the students to sing the roots and play through each scale and chord of the blues by highlighting the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th. Then they go on to provide a blues in the key of F. And for every chord they spell out, the scale associated with it has to be played. For example, in the first chord, which is an F7, they spell out an F mixolydian scale underneath it and ask the students to play it. Later on in the chapter of improvisation, in the Jarvis and Beach book, they use excerpts from the chord voicing book by Matt Harris and Jeff Jarvis to teach students how to spell qualities of 7 chords, the chord symbols associated with the chords, and provide an extensive list of chord symbols and variants of the same chord. The middle school educators took a slightly different approach. When it came to teaching improvisation, the middle schoolers to middle schoolers. The primary theme among the educators was to not overwhelm them with notes and the use of fewer notes. During the interview, Michelle Fernandez-Denlinger said that she uses just 3 notes. She tells the students to write them down on your part, and they would all come up with a little rhythm, 16 bars or so. I would start with 8 measures in a row. They couldn't skip a beat. They had to go. So they all got used to it, and it was just 3 notes. She would end up singing a solo with 3 notes, and she said, whatever you want to do, it's fine. Now, Steve Kirkland takes that same approach, saying, especially if they're young students, 2 notes. 2 notes. 2 notes, take these 2 notes and make a little phrase. And you'd use it on a vamp or something. You pick these 2, and then as the director, he says, you pick these 2 notes that they can't go wrong with. So the secondary theme found from the interviews of the educators was the use of vamps, loops, and backing tracks. So regarding this theme, Steve Kirkland says, get a vamp going on. Depending on what I'm working on, the Aebersold recordings are great. There's a lot of stuff that they can use, especially when you have a young rhythm section and they need to lock into something. So I found that to be really good information. Michelle goes on to say, I would do a merengue pattern or a rock and roll pattern, whichever on keyboard, and I would play these changes, and I would have all these students make anything that they wanted, and I would tell them, use these 3 notes, and then they would go on to say the students would play a song such as Hot Cross Buns and improvise using the 3 notes she gives out. It's a great way to mix the familiar and the unfamiliar for students, particularly in a beginning band setting when you want them to go to your jazz band. So the tertiary theme among the educators was the encouragement of a safe environment. All the educators speak on the value of creating a safe environment for student learning and student success. Eric Rivero says, I think the main thing is that they have to feel safe in your environment, that you're on their side, that you really want the best for them, and that you're trying to help them learn a new language, because that's what it is. It's a new language. Michelle goes a step further by teaching her students how to, quote unquote, break psychological barriers. She says it's basically starting from scratch, getting them to overcome the fear of being judged on their creativity by their peers, which is a big thing for middle schoolers. Everything I would do in middle school was geared towards that, she ends. Many people would call middle school one of the more awkward times as a child because they're not only learning themselves, but also learning the life around them and learning how to cope with that during being in school. That is why creating a safe environment for students is important while learning difficult concepts such as improvisation at the middle school level. When I was a middle school teacher or middle school educator, I had the opportunity to teach a year of jazz. And the 2 most difficult topics that I had problems with was how teaching kids how to swing and teaching kids how to improvise, because they were all afraid to try something new. They lacked the confidence, but as long as you continue to believe, they keep getting better. This is why I agree with starting students off with the easier path to grow in improvisation, just like the educators in the interview. Concept number 2 is listening. The next area we'll look at in the concept is listening. Listening is very important in the jazz idiom. Some of the earliest forms of jazz was taught and learned not by sheet music, but by listening. In the music education world, a lot of people call this the Gordon method, sound before sight. This method of oral method hears tonal patterns and tries to imitate it by singing or patterns back to the originator. Some would think about this as work songs, field hollers, ring shouts, call and response, just to name a few of the earliest forms of jazz. The primary theme regarding listening that was gleaned from the text was that the concept of listening was to understand jazz style and language. Dunscombe and Hill suggests starting with big band recordings because they are probably the most accessible. That way, the educator and the students can focus on blend, balance, sound, intonation, instrumentation, and styles in the jazz ensemble. After the educator suggests listening to selections multiple times to gain a better understanding of the language, whereas Jarvis and Beach start their chapter off by asserting that listening and imitating are the best and most natural ways to learn a new language. And I would agree. They go on to quote the great trumpeter and educator Clark Terry: imitate, assimilate, and innovate. The analysis of the educator interviews garnered two themes. The primary theme was that the educators did most of their listening in school. In the interview, Eric Rivera went on to say, you got to encourage it, and you need to start listening to it in class with them if you have to. Fridays for us is a listening day. We're going to start playing these tunes, and we're going to set up our own little jazz club. It's getting them inspired enough to do it, and the more you educate them and show them the way, the more they want to play like that. Robert Keaton also goes on to say, when he starts with middle schoolers, I used to give them listening assignments that they had to listen to. But now I got around to making them listen to things that I wanted to listen to that was jazz when they started walking into the door of rehearsal. 10 minutes between class. When jazz was playing, I would tell the kids, don't play your instruments, just listen while putting your instruments together. I did that every other day. I'll stand at the door and tell them to get their instruments out and just listen. The educators creates the space for the students to listen in the way that educators want to guide them in their listening. So the secondary theme gathered from the educators was to create assignments that spark their interest. Eric Rivera states that he plays a game with his students, a game where he would go home and listen to something that the kids would like, but in the flip and on the reverse, the kids would have to go home to listen to some jazz that he told them to like. So he tells me a story that one day he comes in and he says, did you guys listen to jazz? And they say, yeah. Did you listen? Then they say, did you listen to so-and-so? And so they put on a piece of music. He was like, oh, I know that. I know who that is. That's so-and-so. I listened to it. You told me that you would listen. I told you that I would listen. And so keeping each other accountable and sparking interest that way. Robert Keating says they have assignments. They have to listen to a certain amount. I know that they don't, but I give them all the tools to do it. Sometimes I'll come into class and ask, did you guys listen to last night DMA? There was such and such that was on. And they'll say, yeah, but do you know who's on tomorrow night? So I'll tell them there's a couple of them will tune in. I say, look, you got all these podcasts that you can go home and listen to. Just go listen. 15 minutes. Put it on while you're doing your math homework. It helps. Just do it. So I believe encouraging students to listen outside of school can be difficult for programs where students don't know much about jazz or listen to it at all. That is why it's important for the instructor to spark interest in the student listening. When I taught in middle school, I would take short listening quizzes where there would be something that I required for them to listen to on their own and then proceed to quiz them on it. I remember one time I put on a Love Supreme by Coltrane, and they said, what is this music? Did not know what it was, did not have an appreciation for it. But by the end of the year, they were listening to Cannonball, and they said, that's a saxophone, that's an alto saxophone. I can tell you, it sounds pretty. The next thing I want to talk about is articulation. The third concept, articulation is another musical concept that the more one listens to it, the more they can align themselves with its sound, the syllabic choices, and the subtle nuances of it. The primary theme garnered from both the Dunscombe and Hill and Jarvis and Beach books were the use of syllables to learn jazz articulation. Dunscombe and Hill state that proper articulation is essential to all successful jazz ensembles in all styles. There are many versions of scat syllables available to educators, so Dunscombe and Hill suggests to use the do and da. It can be used instead of the concert band articulation of tu, tu, ta, ta, right? Because of the placement of the tongue and how it allows the tongue create a smoother articulation. In the Jarvis and Beach chapter on articulation, they decide to use a book entitled The Standardization of Stage Bands Articulation, which was developed from the many Stan Kenton clinics in the 1950s to address articulations. So the second theme taken from the text was listening to articulations to understand style. Dunscombe and Hill state that listening helps develop oral skills to a high degree because jazz styles, the concepts and articulations were almost impossible to notate exactly. Jarvis and Beach state that because of the lack of exposure to swing style at an early age, developing musicians have a harder time grasping the concept. So when it came to gathering the primary themes of articulation from the educator interviews, the educators all went about it the same way, through the teaching of syllables. Eric Rivero uses syllables to demonstrate the differences between classical articulation and jazz articulation by saying, I'm a believer in the syllables of dit, dot, do. At first, they want to keep playing ta, 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 and he demonstrates it online. And I have to tell him, no, that'll never swing. The other misconception is that, he goes on to say that the other misconception is when they see 2 eighth notes equal a quarter eighth, and they try to make a triplet over it. They always want to play dotted 16ths, and then he goes on, da, 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 and he goes on and demonstrates it, and that's not it either. That does not work. He says that does not work, and I can't tell you how many bands I have to correct that with. I tell them they're saying ta, 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 and that's not it. Michelle Fernandez, who teaches workshops all over the country about jazz articulation, has a very interesting way of going about it. She uses metaphors in order to do it. She also says lead sheets. Really, she says lead sheets are the best way for her, I think, to approach articulation because they're all doing it at the same time. And you can really get into this. Do, do, da, dit. And I also talk a lot about metaphors. For example, like metaphor do, she says, pretend you're the most perfectly folded paper airplane on the planet, and it's just gliding across the room. Do. And she does the hand motion and everything. I do it, she says, I do it at every clinic, and I have the kids do it. If there's an accent, you got a basketball, and you're bouncing a basketball against the wall. Then dot. I tell them to think of the target ball. You go to Target and you see this big fat ball there. Dot. Don't think D-O-T, think D-A-H-T, and she spells it out. Those are my metaphors. I instill them from anybody. They're all mine. I use them at every clinic I do. And all of a sudden, I say, anytime you see this rooftop, repeat after me. Target ball. They go, target ball. And they do this gestures with the arm open. I say, anytime you see a tenuto or legato, everybody do this. Say paper airplane. They say paper airplane and do the gestures. Staccatos for symphonic bands is dit, did. Think drop of water bouncing off a leaf. Did, did. Or a ping pong ball bouncing off a timpani head. Or in jazz band, it's dit. I tell them, think of a faucet dripping. Drip, 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 drip. So they say, while gesturing, target ball, paper airplane, basketball, target ball. That's how she goes with it. I personally like using metaphors to teach, especially at the middle school level. I understand not every situation requires a metaphor, but being able to teach students a concept in multiple ways is a skill in and of itself. Michelle uses everyday things that students would see or know about to help explain a concept that would be tough to teach, especially if you have no experience with teaching jazz. As a former middle school educator, I can't tell you the number of times I have had to use metaphors to explain a concept to a student. As stated earlier, not everyone learns and processes information in the same way, so being able to connect something that the students understand and recognize to concepts, and recognize the concepts they're trying to learn can be a great tool while teaching. Concept number 4 is the selection of music. The educator plays a large role in the development of the students by picking the right music that helps to teach concepts and provides a challenge for the students. So the 4th concept, which is very important for younger students, is the selection of music. While conducting this study, I found out something very interesting. While gathering information from the pedagogy books and the educator interviews, I found 2 themes that are common for both the educators and the text. The first theme was to pick music based on the ability of your student. That doesn't mean you should pick music that doesn't challenge your student. It means that you, as the educator of the students in the ensemble, should be realistic about the expectations set for them. If the students exceed the expectations, great, you got another piece that you can pull out of your back pocket. So what does the text say about the selection of music? Dunscombe and Hill have an entire chapter dedicated to the selection of music. The authors go on to provide information such as the range of instruments, the lead players, bass trombone, lead trumpet, at the collegiate level. I don't know about many middle schoolers hitting double C's, but they're probably out there. That is something that is important because those are the two musicians that dictate the amount of music an ensemble can play. They also discuss what could be problematic for certain players within certain sections, knowing performance needs and the endurance of wind players and musical style limitations at that age. Jarvis and Beach provide 6 tips on selecting charts. They suggest 1, you listen to demos, recordings, and study the scores. 2, determine if you understand what it takes to teach the chart. 3, program music that showcases the strength of your band. 4, select music that challenges the band but doesn't overwhelm them. Conversely, do not select music that is too easy. 5, choose charts that are suitable for teaching improvisation. And 6, charts often have unison trumpet lines that extend into the upper register. These parts are usually performed down an octave without compromising the integrity of a chart, which they speak a lot about within there, which about changing charts, changing sections. The educators had the same theme when interviewed. During the interview, Steve Kirkland put it as simple as this: perhaps you got a kick-ass trumpet section, so you build around your ensemble. So pick a good balance of like easy charts, medium charts, and challenging charts. A question one could ask is, I know what I have to work with, but there are so many charts of the same name to choose from. Eric Rivera helps with this. He says, I usually have several arrangements of a chart depending on what the tune is and the strength of my band. He then proceeded to tell me that listening to as many arrangements of tunes helps him figure out what works and what simply doesn't. So the secondary theme between the text and the educators was to find teaching concepts that teach in the music. And as a former middle school, teacher and music education student, I learned that just because there aren't any standardized tests given to music classes like there are in math, science, and reading, that doesn't mean that there aren't concepts that need to be taught to students. The difficult part for me as a young educator was finding which musical concepts to teach the students in the ensemble throughout the year. So as a pro tip, just because the administration does not check on your lesson plans daily, weekly, or monthly doesn't mean that they were not going to do it at all. There comes a time in every school year where teachers get observed and they won't tell you, but if they ask to see your lesson plans and you need to make sure that you have it in order so they can, and it's understandable to someone who does not teach music because they will look at it. They may not be able to understand what a quarter note triplet is, but they can see your sequence of events. So Dunscombe and Hill suggests that the educator chooses the quality of the pieces for the students to learn. They go on to urge the educators to not just purchase pop tunes just because they're popular. And lastly, not to lose sight of the jazz program, which is to play jazz. Jarvis and Beach state that whether an educator is sufficient in understanding of a chart to teach it is important. If the educator doesn't understand the chart themselves, it'll be a tough time teaching the students that concept. Robert Keating goes on to say, you teach through the music you're teaching. You find the music that fits your curriculum that you're trying to teach, and Steve Kirkland echoes the same sentiment, just because it's a unit of instruction. The educators place an emphasis on the curriculum, or using the curriculum to find music to be played so that students can learn the concept, not only for now, but for later as well. The next concept I want to touch on is the concept of rehearsal techniques. At any level of music making, the ability to rehearse effectively is important. Being at a university such as the Frost School of Music with very talented musicians who can make it seem like rehearsal time can fly by because the musicians care about the ensemble sound, how they sound, and for the most part, always want to be there. But what happens when you get a class full of students with shorter attention spans? Not nearly the same level, and may not want to be in your class. Keeping younger students involved is vital to making sure your lesson plan can go as smoothly, especially with all the extraneous factors mentioned above. When it came to rehearsal techniques, Dunscombe and Hill state that there are 3 P's to rehearsing: planning, planning, and planning. They also go on to mention that planning a rehearsal out is important because it encourages a more productive and fun session, not only for the educator, but for the students as well. Jarvis and Beach talk about planning in a different way. In their chapter on rehearsal techniques, they state that the first thing a director should do is choose music in advance, because there's a lack of time in the school system. You don't want to waste time searching for music. That's also a form of planning. There wasn't a definitive theme when I gathered from the educators as it related to the rehearsal technique. So I'm just going to give you some of what the educators said about rehearsing their bands at the middle school level. Eric Rivero says this: I don't change anything for my middle school. I don't curse. I treat them all like adults. I don't curse at them or anything, but I'm intense when I start working. Steve Kirkland says every day is different. So if you're learning the ending, for example, if you're learning the ending, go back to the section before. And before you know it, you have the entire piece if you continue doing the same thing. Michelle Fernandez-Denlinger says, I was never one to really have set lesson plans because I used to like to gauge what I needed to do right then and there. And lastly, Robert Keating says, slow it down. If they can't play it slow, they definitely can't play it fast. So just start slow. These are some quotes just from the educators about how they go about rehearsing and their rehearsal techniques. So the secondary theme of the rehearsal techniques found in the pedagogy book was listening. Creating time to listen to jazz is a very important aspect of rehearsal, and the text agrees with that point. Dunscombe and Hill state that listening is the biggest key to having a successful jazz band. Listening also makes the director's explanations during rehearsal more understandable to the students. For example, if I'm a director and I'm trying to explain the concept of laying behind the beats or playing behind the beat one way I could approach this by clapping on 2 and 4 while singing laid back 8 notes. Listening and having them experience the concept can be a vital part to them learning. Listening and experience for the students. But it's true, learning vocabulary, transcribing, and articulation are just a few concepts that can be learned through listening. Listening is very important. So the last thing from the text is more of a saying. Good rehearsals translate to good performances. Dunscombe and Hill state that a good performance comes from good rehearsals. Therefore, the better the rehearsal, the better the performance. Jarvis and Beach say the same thing. If it didn't happen at rehearsal, it definitely won't happen in the performance. I totally agree with what the authors are saying, and I believe it holds true for middle school pedagogy. I believe that students at this level require a few things: structure, repetition, and belief. For example, if a director can structure and streamline what they're teaching of a musical passage, the more a student can play a passage correctly at that level, and then that in turn reinforces the belief for them to do it when it counts the most in a concert. The last concept I want to talk about or want to discuss my findings for is the concept of other styles of music. Being born and bred in Miami-Dade County has allowed me certain experiences and have a front row seat to great music from different Caribbean countries. Unfortunately, this is not the case everywhere in the county or the country, not at the middle school level at least, and not even at the public school system in Miami. Jazz has the opportunity to teach so much more than just hot cross buns or lightly row, as bands typically play at this level. So how did the text go about teaching other styles? In the chapter, Dunscombe and Hill primarily talk about the Latin jazz concepts. And being in Miami, Latin jazz concepts. What the primary theme is of listening. The authors state that the music was passed down from generation to generation with no music. So listening and immersing oneself in it is very critical. They go on to discuss everything from different styles and rhythms of Latin music, such as the son, the cha-cha-cha, the bossa, the rumba, the guaguancó, the bamba, the samba, the merengue. The authors then talk about the historical roots of Cuban and Brazilian music, Lastly, they present rhythms for each style, one with traditional instruments and the other with modified instruments such as the drum set. And unfortunately, there was no chapter dedicated to other styles of music in the Jarvis and Beach book. So the primary theme gathered from the educators on this topic was still listening. During the interview, Eric Rivero stated that he uses a book called The Art of Afro-Cuban Percussion by Ed Uribe. It has audio examples. He says it has audio examples in the back and writes out the different rhythms and styles for the different Latin rhythms. It's extremely helpful, he says. Kids can see the patterns, what the patterns look like, and what they sound like. So this is very helpful for students in middle school because most of them are in the concrete stage of learning, right? Concrete versus abstract. Being able to see something versus being able to think about something and just do it. Concrete versus abstract. Eric goes on to tell a story. Eric goes on to tell a story about one of the times he had a Dominican student and they were playing a merengue. And in this merengue, the Dominican student would always, okay. And so one day he asked the student, he's like, do you mind teaching the rhythm section how it's actually supposed to be done? Just like Grease Lightning. The kid got up, started saying, it's supposed to be like this. No, feel it like this and that. So sometimes the best teachers are the ones sitting in the seats that you're teaching. I thought it's different. I thought it was definitely different, and it definitely holds true. The student learns ins and outs of the music growing up, so being able to teach it wasn't difficult for him. It's just learning. It's just like it's learning for the first time. So a bonus takeaway of another style of music that Eric was telling me about is one day he gave a clinic on funk to a middle school band, and the first thing he says, does anyone know a modern artist who plays funk? Students look around, nothing. He says, you guys hear him on the radio all the time. And they're like, nothing. He says, what about Bruno Mars? And they say, oh, we listen to Bruno Mars. Yeah, modern funk. But he goes, do you know about the person that was the king of funk before Bruno Mars? They're like, no. What's before Bruno Mars? James Brown. So being able to show and introduce who James Brown was, his music, and the percussiveness of his singing, which is a big thing for teaching funk. Being able to do that and be able to take what students know and what they're learning while also learning about other musicians can help popularize that form of music. I don't know what I wrote there, but that's not how it's supposed to come out. So once again, listening is a very important aspect of learning other styles of music. Also, having a director who knows what they're talking about helps as well. You get a lot of students who graduate with a degree, and they may not understand what it is to pick up the pieces, or they may not understand what, mambo influenciano mean, or how to play that. So being able to have text that can help with that, or being able to go into someone's room to help with that is very vital, very important. So, in conclusion, it's a nice little picture. Teaching middle school jazz can be tough and scary, but one way to increase the number of educators that feel comfortable teaching jazz is to provide them with resources from a variety of angles to help them achieve success. So it is with my hope that this study can provide professional insights, resources, and pedagogical concepts from both expert educators and pedagogy books to help inexperienced educators achieve a successful jazz program. Once again, my name is Bryant. I thank you all for coming out and spending some time with me. Have a great day.
That's beautiful. That was